Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Thomas didn't want to go to that godforsaken village, and it was not because his wife thought it would be better. The man understood that with his illness, life there would be simply unbearable. Thomas had learned about his serious illness only 2 months earlier, when he decided to undergo a medical examination at a private clinic due to his deteriorating health. That is when it turned out that the young businessman had a very serious illness that required timely and qualified treatment. But when the young businessman left the walls of the clinic and told about the prospects of possible treatments, Betty, he did not see support in the eyes of his wife. All these doctors only want one thing. They only want to get money out of you, and the result of all this is quite predictable, said the girl irritably. Thomas's health was deteriorating by the day, and it was unlikely that this could have helped to strengthen the family bond. All the more so because Betty had led him gently, as if unobtrusively, to move to the country. Honey, the air is cleaner there, the forest, the river nearby. And here, there's nothing but exhaust fumes and perpetual stress. You'll rest there. You'll come to your senses, my wife said with an expert look. Well, what about work? It's not just my baby. You know how much effort my late father put into it, and how many people will be left on the street and without a decent wage. I can't just drop everything and disappear from sight. Thomas tried to object. Unfortunately, it was simply impossible to change Betty's mind. In her desire to help her sick husband, she could have resorted to the most radical methods. Thomas looked sadly at his wife and found himself thinking that in some ways she was right. Well, what's the use of me? I'm so weak that I can't hold a meeting properly. I have to interrupt several times. And the competitors? They won't make any concessions because I'm sick. I am sure that such a piece of pie would hardly be refused by the financial leaders of the city, for whom there have never been prohibitions and barriers, thought the businessman to himself. By the time he was 29, Thomas had achieved everything he could have dreamed of in his youth. He had his own business, a steady income, an expensive car, and a fancy mansion in an upscale part of town. Thomas' father was a humble engineer who in his time taught his son the basics of market trading and accustomed him to hard work. These lessons were not in vain for the determined boy, and he did everything in his power to succeed in the future. Although Thomas now lived in NY, he was born in a small provincial town. There, in his father's old house, the man, in his own opinion, lived the best years of his life. Thomas's father worked from morning till night to save money to pay for his son's university education. With all this, the boy did not feel hurt or disadvantaged at all. Thomas knew that his parents would give him the last of their money so that he would not need anything. When the boy graduated with honors from university and with the help of his father went into big business, he did not know that it would eventually become the main thing of his life. Unfortunately, James and Anna did not see such outstanding success of their son for the reason that not long before they died in tragic circumstances. The death of his parents was a severe blow to the businessman, which knocked him out of control for many months. At that moment, it seemed to Thomas that his life was over, and he would never be the same again. But time not only flows unnoticed, it also heals, as philosophers of all times have long said. Luckily, Thomas had the very knack that helped him make good deals and see promising directions. At 27, the man earned his first million and married Betty, whom he met at a party. The pretty coquette immediately discerned the enormous benefits of a possible marriage to such a wealthy fiancé. At the time he met Betty, Thomas was already a self-sufficient man with a solid bank account and his own firm selling building materials. Therefore, clinging to him like a leech, the girl from the first days of acquaintance charmed the young businessman with her courtship and natural charm. It must be said that all of Thomas' wealth was not strictly inherited from his wealthy parents, and all that he had now was achieved through hard work and sweat. He was one of the first in the region to have the idea of selling building materials on the internet. Being a naturally far-sighted and creative entrepreneur, Thomas made sure that his late father's business would live on. After the young people got married, our hero came to terms with the fact that his newly married wife became a housewife who spent most of her time in beauty salons and restaurants. Unfortunately, the disease crept up on Thomas suddenly and hit him where it wasn't expected at all. Thomas always thought illness wasn't about him. After all, he went to the gym and swam. At his age, he looked at most 20, and unlike most of his peers, led a healthy lifestyle. And then, about 2 months ago, Thomas fell ill. At first, the young businessman could not even identify the exact source of his discomfort. The pain seemed to originate somewhere in the subcostal area, and then spread in a painful wave throughout his entire torso. After undergoing a CT scan, the businessman found out a very disappointing diagnosis. The suspicion of cancer sounded to Thomas like a thunderbolt out of the blue. It seemed to him that all this was not happening to him, and that just to rub his eyes, the nightmare would disappear on its own. But no matter how much Thomas tried to put himself in a good mood, it invariably got worse. On top of that, the work environment had become unbearable. Thomas felt as if his competitors were conspiring to remove him from the financial arena, like enemy aggressors on the battlefield. The businessman could not rely on anybody in particular, because among his subordinates, there was no one capable of replacing the boss in such a difficult situation. It was at this point that Betty offered her help. And what? I know how to manage. What is there in this business? Everything is predictable and clear. Buy low here and sell high there. What could be so special? Said the girl who had 2 years of university under her belt, left behind due to unbearable boredom. Her husband tried to explain to her the ins and outs of this difficult business, but as was to be expected, it was a pointless and thankless task. Betty only cared about shopping and beauty salons, not exactly how money was made for her entertainment. They met Thomas 2 years ago, when the young businessman already had a history of unsuccessful relationships. In terms of looks, Betty had no complaints. This long-legged beauty could drive anyone crazy. It so happened that from the first minutes of acquaintance, Thomas felt a persistent attraction to Betty, who turned out to be an experienced coquette in these matters. By that time, Thomas no longer had any family left, and there was no one to help advise the young businessman. That is why his acquaintance with Betty became the very factor that helped him to distract from the working life and thoughts about his past. Their romance erupted so suddenly that by the heat of passion it became clear to all acquaintances of the businessman that the impending wedding was just around the corner. Many friends tried to prevent Thomas from taking such a rash step, insinuating that first of all his bride needed his money, and only then he himself. Unfortunately, love is often blind, and the example of the young businessman was a clear proof of that. If Thomas had not shown signs of illness, though, it would have been difficult to say how their future married life would have proceeded. Through her actions, Betty gently encouraged her husband to accept her proposal and move to the country. I've got a nice house for you, too. It's a bit out of the way, so the locals won't bother you. And I'll come to you with a doctor. You can come every day if you want. But I'll have to take care of your work, too. I don't think I'll see you that often, she chirped. Come on, I don't have to. I can take it, Thomas said in a shaky voice. His condition had been worsening day by day lately, but he couldn't make up his mind to have the operation. On Thomas's part, it was an extremely reckless move, because no one takes care of your health better than he does. The young businessman lacked the impetus to decide to be treated at a clinic whose specialists had extensive experience in treating such ailments. Most often in such cases, the opinion of a spouse or parents is the impetus, but Thomas, in fact, had neither. First of all, Betty cared only about her own well-being, and then about all other issues. For this very reason, the beauty was in no hurry to have children, and referring to the fact that she wanted to live for herself, cut off such conversations at the root. Since the move to the village was scheduled for tomorrow, the husband tried to pack a bag of things that could be useful to him in this wilderness. But no matter how much he tried, everything fell out of his hands, and his mood remained prohibitively low. In the end, Thomas simply heaped everything into his duffel bag and sat on the edge of the bed. The businessman's strength was fading before his eyes, and the realization of that made him very uncomfortable. The night before the trip, Thomas hardly slept. The uncertainty was frightening and filled the young businessman's heart with anxiety. Lately, he and Betty had been sleeping in separate rooms, and that spoke volumes. But the main surprise awaited Thomas in the morning, when, citing an indisposition, his wife suggested that he take a cab to the village. "Of course I take you personally, honey. It's not a problem. But I have to be at the office by 9. You know, the partners won't wait. They're like sharks, just waiting to get their hands on a bigger piece," Betty said guiltily, her eyes downcast. Thomas immediately changed his face, and then, with a sad look, began to dress. The young businessman still couldn't believe that his wife could be so indifferent to him. But when the cab driver Betty called drove him out of town, Thomas realized that things had gone too far. They drove for hours, covering over 300 kilometers. As luck would have it, the driver was awfully chatty and went on and on about his own business. The price of gasoline jumped. The chassis was knocking like 100 rabid drummers, and the boss did not give money for its repair. In the end, the cab driver brought Thomas to some godforsaken village, where half of the houses were simply abandoned. Thomas sighed sadly and did not comment on the situation. What else could he say? That his wife had sent him to the countryside to die? What could be good about that? The man resigned himself. He didn't care. When the businessman saw where he was, he swallowed nervously and collapsed. Thomas got out of the car with the bag in his hands and then looked around. Wasn't a soul in sight outside, and the old house Betty had bought looked dreary and neglected. To the businessman's mind, the little house looked more like the dwelling of some fairy tale character, with the same gable roof and a sideways leading chimney, than the shelter of a sick man. However, the businessman had no time to think about it, because the cab driver had already put his things on the ground and drove the car in order to get back to the city before dark. The man sighed sorrowfully and looked longingly after the car as it drove away, then entered the yard, overgrown with weeds and bushes. Staggering from side to side with fatigue, the businessman opened the door and found himself inside a long, unventilated room where all objects and the floor were covered with a thick layer of dust. "Wow, and this is the house my beloved wife bought me. It's a wreck." Thomas grimaced as he realized the seriousness of his situation. The businessman began to arrange his things and put them in order. The resentment against his wife still lived in his heart, but after the general cleaning of the house, it was not so acute and painful. Thomas understood that in addition to the hassle of making a home, he had another problem associated with the lack of means of subsistence. Normally, Betty should have bought his spouse some groceries and medicine, so he could get through a few days of being completely alone. But when Thomas looked around the house, he realized there wasn't even a refrigerator, not to mention groceries and stuff. Fortunately, there was a well in the backyard, and in the pantry were several pounds of sprouting potatoes and an old electric stove. Rummaging through his jacket pocket, the man scraped together about $10 in small bills, but it was hardly enough to get him through life. "Wow, I'm in a mess, of course. Would Betty really be coming to see me every day, traveling more than 300 kilometers? That's a lie," Thomas thought with a pained grin. "There's almost a week's worth of work. Yeah, Betty helped me out. I'll tell you that much. Buying trash and being so herself," the businessman whispered as he began to clean up. Needless to say, it was a lot of effort for a man who could barely stand up from fatigue and a sharp pain in his stomach. As it happened, Thomas had only calmed down by midnight, when he finally got the house into a more or less acceptable shape. That said, the young businessman had eaten practically nothing all day, except for some tea and a piece of candy bar in the morning. But Thomas simply had no energy left to prepare a meal, so he went to bed on an empty stomach, and the next morning, the man woke up to a soft knock on the door. Puzzled as to who it could be, he opened the door and saw on the threshold a puny little girl of about 7 years old, holding a wicker basket covered with a white towel. "Good morning, Uncle. My grandmother sent me to you. We made pies with her, with potatoes and cabbage. We poured a jar of milk and gave her some cottage cheese. She says it's not nice." "It's not neighborly," said the little girl. In surprise, the man did not even immediately find something to say, so he simply invited the little girl into the house. The little girl looked at the scrubbed floors and smiled understandably. Hard-working girl knew how much effort and energy absorbed the man this unplanned cleaning. After boiling the kettle on the old electric stove, Thomas made her tea with raspberry jam, taken from the same hospitable pantry, and asked, "Why didn't Grandma come herself? We could have gotten to know each other. I'm a newcomer here." The little girl took a small sip of fragrant tea and then answered, "My grandmother cannot see well. She is almost blind. She does everything almost by touch. She milks cows, feeds chickens, and even makes medicines." "What other potions?" Thomas couldn't help it. The girl looked at him and, without hiding her surprise, answered, "What do you mean? What remedies?" "The most medicinal of all. My grandmother had people coming from all over the region." Thomas smiled and, feeling hungry, began to eat the pies. To say that they were insanely delicious was to say nothing. The man thought it was the tastiest thing he had ever tasted in his life. As it turned out later, the little guest's name was Maria, and her kind grandmother Emily. How they found out about the new tenant was a mystery to Thomas, but apparently this is the village, so they know everything about everyone. After talking with Maria some more, the businessman thanked her for her help and promised to visit her one day. "If I live long enough, I'll definitely go in," Thomas thought ironically. After seeing the girl off, the businessman decided to call his wife. Betty promised to check on his spouse's condition almost daily, but she sent him to the middle of nowhere and disappeared. What was Thomas' surprise when the indifferent voice of the cellular operator informed him that the subscriber was out of range. And where does she disappear to? Is she so busy that she is not even interested in the health of her husband? The man thought longingly. Deep down, he still couldn't believe that his wife had sent him to live out his last days in the middle of nowhere. Thomas thought that the phone would ring and he would hear Betty's joyful voice again. But as time passed, he still had not heard from his wife. Realizing that he didn't want to just sit and indulge in despondency, Thomas decided through sheer force to keep himself busy. First of all, it concerned the house and its surroundings. Especially, the man was discouraged by the fence, which was practically lying on the ground, held solely on its word of honor. It was clear to him that the house and yard needed the skilled assistance of an experienced builder, not a sick businessman who could barely stand on his feet from weakness and malaise. In the shed behind the house, in addition to all kinds of unnecessary junk, there were nails covered with rust and quite good quality pine boards. He decided to start the restoration work with the fence. There was still plenty of time left before darkness, so Thomas decided to spend it wisely. As he struggled with the rotten boards, which were literally hanging on by a thread, the man tried desperately to make the fence look more or less normal. Since Thomas intended to be outside all day, he brought with him some leftover breakfast cakes that his kind neighbor Emily had given him. In spite of his weakness and feverishness, the businessman felt hunger, most likely caused by being out in the fresh air for so long. After repairing about a third of the fence, just in time for his lunch break, the businessman sat down on a half-rotten, decrepit stump near an old barn and decided to have something to eat. Suddenly, trying to fumble for another pie in the basket, Thomas found to his surprise that it was empty. It looked so amazing that he could not believe his eyes. Could it be that I was having visual hallucinations? But the disease can't progress that fast, can it? Puzzled as to where his lunch might have gone, the man looked around and got up from the stump. Only when Thomas looked around the corner of the barn did he see a tiny, furry thief nibbling on a tasty treat. The thief turned out to be a little black puppy of an unknown breed, who continued his meal without the slightest embarrassment. The businessman gently touched the baby with his hand and could not contain his smile at the sight of the puppy, which wagged its little tail in response and grunted softly. The man, who had wanted a dog all his life, decided to take the baby with him. Thomas understood that the puppy would most likely die on the street, and he simply could not let that happen. He took the dog in his arms, brought him inside, and laid him down on the old, soft blanket. Thomas's heart immediately felt as warm as it had never felt before. "There's no telling how long I'll live, but I'll try to make the most of this time," the man whispered, pouring milk for the baby. The unpleasant symptoms of Thomas' illness were not going anywhere, but at least the thought of them temporarily receded. The businessman realized that he was only deluding himself, and the problem wasn't going anywhere. But it felt so good to be deluded that Thomas even forgot about Betty and her shameful act for a while. By naming the puppy Jackus, the man found the faithful friend he had dreamed of for years. Now that his life had meaning, he could not give up the disease without a fight. After all, if anything should happen to Thomas, who would care for Jackus? He tried not to think about his wife, and now all his attention was on Nathan. As Thomas became so involved with Jack, he did not even notice how many days passed. The puppy behaved like a true conqueror in the house, trying to chew to shreds everything his small, sharp teeth can reach. During this time, Betty called only once, and, citing problems, sang in an angelic voice, "Well, hello, honey. How are you? I'm sorry it was so short and unprepared. Take my word for it, it's not what I wanted at all. But your firm is in big trouble. I'll do what I can, of course, but I'm not a magician." Thomas turned pale as chalk and cautiously asked, "What other problems?" "Wait, but everything was fine before I left. It's only been a little while, and you're acting like we're already bankrupt." There was a tense pause on the other end of the line, after which Betty abruptly changed the subject. Lamenting that she had forgotten to leave her husband money, the beauty promised to visit him as soon as possible. Here we go, more promises, Thomas thought with a pained grin. The businessman realized that as a reward for his tolerance and love for his wife, he now found himself all alone on the outskirts of a semi-abandoned remote village. Not only that, but Betty left his spouse at the most difficult and crucial time, when he was ill and most of all hoped for her help and support. Not even hoping for his wife's arrival, Thomas spent his last money buying bread at the store and returned to the house, which he jokingly began to call his final resting place. Since the pantry contained some vegetables left by the previous owner, the man realized that he could easily survive a few more days, especially since Maria's little neighbor gave him occasional gifts from her caring grandmother. Sometimes a pie with blackberries, then pies with cabbage or cottage cheese. Thomas himself had only seen the old woman a couple of times, and even then, because of his poor eyesight, she could only hear his voice. To Thomas's great surprise, Betty showed up the very next day. She grimaced and approached the house, accompanied by a suspicious-looking man with the face of an inveterate crook clerk. On smelling the strangers, little Jackus immediately greeted them with a gushing yapping. "You, what is this little creep? How could you have that shaggy beast in your own house?" said Betty indignantly. "Don't be afraid, it's Rascal. He's a good boy and he never barks when he's not doing something," Thomas said to lighten the mood. During this time, the young businessman has become quite thin and gaunt, which has not gone unnoticed by his wife. "Honey, I brought you some medicine. Very scarce, by the way. They're foreign, and they don't come cheap. I'll tell you that," Betty said, and she took a pack of plastic jars of pills out of her pocket. Thomas looked at his wife strangely, then took the medicine in his hands and ran a glance at what was written on the label. "It's all in a foreign language. I can't make it out," the man said in surprise. In an attempt to portray resentment and sincere indignation, the wife's face changed dramatically. But after all, these are foreign drugs. It would be foolish to expect that they will be accompanied by a translation with explanations for those who are particularly understanding, added the long-legged beauty. Thomas shrugged his shoulders and turned his gaze to his wife's companion. "Oh, that's notary, honey," Betty immediately exclaimed. "A notary? Why would I need a notary?" said Thomas, genuinely surprised. As if to confirm his words, the little boy sitting on the floor yelped in agreement. Betty smiled charmingly and continued, "In order to run the firm, I need your signature on a package of documents. These competitors are just trying to rip us off. I'm sure that if I had waited a little longer, we would have been left penniless. I know you're going to get better, but before you do, I need all the leverage I can get." Only now did Thomas understand the purpose of his wife's visit. He could have refused to sign any papers. But on the other hand, Betty was still Thomas's wife, and it was reckless and risky not to trust her. Deep down, the businessman did not blame his wife for taking him to this village. Frankly speaking, Thomas was afraid of surgery and belonged to the type of people for whom hospital walls are akin to a prison cell. By signing the package of documents provided by his wife, The young businessman was actually giving the firm to her personal use. There were still accounts in the bank, but without his presence, Betty could not dispose of them at her discretion. That's it, honey. Don't forget to take your medicine. Oh, and I brought you some things and money, of course. There's enough to last me a year in this hick town, Betty said as she left, and she looked wary at Rascal, who was sitting at the door. Thomas immediately followed his wife's advice and removed the plastic lid from the jar and took out a capsule. After drinking water from the jug, the man walked Betty to the door, sincerely hoping that she would not notice his bodily weakness. He felt no particular anger toward Betty at this point. After all, if Thomas was to die, let it be in this remote village, where he had no enemies who were unlikely to feel regret at the sight of a fresh mound on his grave. Only a couple of hours had passed since Betty's departure, and Thomas was feeling much worse than he had before her visit. The businessman's head was suddenly buzzing like a beehive of wild bees, and his mouth was filled with a luscious bitterness that worsened his already bad condition. The man tried to go to the door to ask Emily for help, but only managed to grab the handle when he collapsed. Falling into the sticky, dark haze, he mentally said goodbye to the life he thought had ended on such a sad note. Thomas awoke only the next morning, having slept for over 17 hours. The man looked around in astonishment to see that he was not in his own house, but in some clean, small room which smelled of lime, wormwood, and some unknown herbs. Thomas tried to get up from the bed, but the weakness he felt prevented him from doing so. At that moment, the door opened, and, squinting blindly, a frail old woman entered the room. "Well, my dear, are you awake? That's good. I'm going to give you a healing potion. You'll feel better. My name is Emily. You probably remember," the stranger said and handed Thomas a cup of the tart, fragrant liquid inside. The man smiled embarrassedly and accepted the healing drink from the old woman's hands. Emily turned out to be a nice, pleasant woman practicing alternative medicine to treat patients. Those who came to her house who were desperate and considered themselves incurably ill. Emily lived alone with her granddaughter, and helping people suffering from various ailments became her raison d'etre. Living in a house on the edge of the village, the half-blind woman helped everyone who came to her. "And how did I end up here?" Thomas asked after drinking the potion. The old woman smiled and answered softly, "And it was Maria who spotted you when you collapsed flat on the threshold. So the two of us dragged you into the house. You don't have any weight in you. You were exhausted because of your illness. Or maybe your wife, a snake in the ground, did something to help. What could she have done to help me so much that I almost gave my soul to God? And anyway, what makes you think that?" the man asked perplexedly. "You're as naive as a grouse in a flock, by God. She came to see me before she left. She told me that you were incurably ill, and even promised me money if after your death I would take care of the funeral." "And what did you say to her?" asked the guest in a trembling voice. "What could I say to her? I kicked her out of the house and wished her good luck. It is not good, when you have a living husband, to write him in the dead," sensibly answered the old woman. Tears came to Thomas' eyes at the thought that if it weren't for that sweet old lady and her granddaughter, he wouldn't even be alive anymore. "Don't be sad. You can still be helped. I can feel it. Don't believe what the doctors at the clinic told you. Everything will be fine. I can see it in my heart, though I'm almost blind with my eyes," Emily added. "Thank you. I appreciate it very much," Thomas answered feelingly. "Don't, dearie. It's not me you should thank. It's Maria. If it hadn't been for her, you would have got there yourself long ago. It was she who brought the puppy in secret, so that you wouldn't be so sad. And she saw you on the porch. With my eyes, I could never see it," said the old woman. Thomas stayed at Emily's house for about 3 weeks, during which time he became very attached to the old woman. But the most amazing thing was that after Emily's treatment, the man felt as if there had never been any illness at all. For himself, Thomas had made up his mind a long time ago. He did not want to leave the cozy house in the village, which had long been his home. It is hard to say whether the businessman's healing was a miracle or whether it was Emily's right therapy, but there was no doubt that he was much better. On top of that, Thomas did not take the medicine Betty had left him, which, according to the elderly healer, was pure poison. In all this time, Betty had not once come, not even to call her sick husband, who she had essentially left to die in the remote countryside. With his increasing attention to Emily and Maria, Thomas helped with the household chores, fetching water from the well, and feeding the cattle. Perhaps if a man had been told before that it was possible to enjoy working in the countryside, he wouldn't have believed a word of it. But now, life in this wilderness had certainly made him, if not happy, at least hopeful for a brighter future. Once, when Maria ran to the store to get some bread, Emily came up to Thomas and started a very strange conversation. "You probably don't know, but Maria is not my own granddaughter. She was about 4 at the time. My eyesight was still good, so I found her by chance," the old woman began. Thomas looked at his companion with surprise and prepared to listen to her detailed story. It happened 3 years ago when passing by a house. Emily noticed something strange in its windows. A girl about 4 years old was standing on the windowsill. Tears welled up in the little girl's eyes, so the elderly healer didn't hesitate one bit to enter the house. What Emily saw inside made her uneasy. Almost the entire floor of the house was strewn with empty bottles of liquor and cigarette butts. Inside, it was filthy, like a barn, as if it had never been cleaned before. Emily cautiously stepped around the mountain of garbage and approached the trembling little girl. "Don't be afraid, honey. I won't hurt you," the old woman whispered softly and took the girl in her arms. Emily had already noticed that there was no one in the house but the baby, so she immediately decided to take the girl with her. That's Maria Goryanova. Her mother, Urka, raised the girl all by herself. They say she gave birth to her. She always liked to drink and party. The policeman exclaimed when he saw an old woman walking with a girl in her arms. "Yes, you can't do that. It's a child after all. You can't just leave her alone. Take away that mother's parental rights and be done with it." Emily shouted in anger, clutching the girl to her. The policeman shrugged his shoulders and looked guiltily at his fellow villager. There were several villages in Frank's department, and due to the lack of personnel, he had to be literally torn between the most remote points of the district. It was physically impossible for him to keep track of all the offenses, especially when it came to such a delicate matter as the deprivation of parental rights. Understanding the awkwardness of the precinct officer's situation, Emily took Maria home to feed and warm her. The little girl happily jumped at the treat, as if she hadn't eaten in days. Watching the little girl eagerly drink the milk, Emily could not hold back tears. Finally, when Maria was full, the old woman put her to bed. Of course, according to the law, Emily had no right to take the girl to her home. But on the other hand, she could not leave her alone in the house of her negligent mother either. Since Frank did not object to the fact that the girl would live in the old lady's house for a while, Maria stayed with Emily. About 2 weeks later, sad news spread around the neighborhood. The girl's mother had a drunken binge with her lover, who had recently been released from prison. "That's how Maria became my family, Thomas. I wasn't going to give her to an orphanage after her good-for-nothing mother died. She's a good girl. She's smart. She should have a normal family. I'm old now. I can't dance at her graduation. I've lived my whole life alone. I've devoted my whole life to healing. Plus, my eyesight's been really bad. Maria's like a guide for me. She'll tell me what to do. She'll give me the right herbs. I can heal even half blind, but still, it's much better and quieter with a helper," concluded the old woman. At that moment, Thomas's heart snapped treacherously. More than anything, the man wanted to thank the kind old woman and her granddaughter for saving his life, which had been a miracle to him. Thomas had not undergone a second medical examination and may well not have been cured permanently. But there was no doubt that Emily's treatment had brought him relief. Also, Thomas was anxious to deal with his wife, who had treated him so cruelly. The fact was that when the businessman, on Emily's advice, through the district officer, submitted the medicine for examination, it turned out that in the case of his illness, this drug became for the patient purest poison. To forgive this, the deceived husband could no longer. Being naive and trusting by nature, he to the last believed that his wife could not want his death. But when the examination revealed the very fact of the potential crime, Thomas moved on to more decisive action. And the most interesting thing awaited him when he returned to the city. He was surprised to learn that Betty was already in custody. As it turned out, the cunning beauty punished herself when, with the help of an accomplice who looked like Thomas, she tried to withdraw money from his bank account. The bank's security service acted promptly, and soon the terrified Betty was testifying at the police station. Crying, the girl said she was not guilty of anything and only wanted to withdraw money from the account of her husband, who allegedly did not need it anymore. Needless to say, when Thomas showed up in town, his return caused quite a furor. But most of all, the doctors at the clinic were surprised, who after a medical examination announced that the man was completely healthy. And only the businessman himself smiled enigmatically and mentally thanked Emily, an elderly healer, who was able to put him on his feet with her potions and incantations. After demanding a divorce from Betty, Thomas sold his house in the city and moved to the countryside. Despite the abundance of circumstantial evidence of the beauty's guilt, law enforcement officials were never able to bring a criminal case against her. Drugs given to Betty were not poison and were contraindicated only Thomas due to the peculiarities of his illness. The businessman was well aware that it is unlikely that his wife simply made a mistake in the choice of medicines, which, moreover, was brought from abroad. The truth came out on its own when it was discovered that Betty had already had a lover on the side for quite some time. It was he who saw an opportunity to become rich in the event of Thomas' death in the remote village. The lover's calculation was as simple as anything ingenious. Without proper care and nurturing, Thomas would not last long in that wilderness. And while the businessman was fighting for his life in the remote village, the conspirators tried to clean up his business and withdraw all the money from his accounts. And if with the firm, Betty and her lover achieved some results, at the bank they were in for a complete fiasco. Having everything, the cheeky beauty didn't appreciate what life gave her, and at one point, lost everything she had. But for Thomas, life changed for the better. There, with the proceeds from the sale of real estate, the young businessman decided to build a boarding house for people who have lost their last hope of healing. Special attention in the treatment will be given to Emily's methodology, who, though weak in sight, was still a very good healer. One day, a new nurse arrived within the walls of the boarding house, coming from a small town in search of a better life. Since Thomas personally approved the medical staff, the interview took place in his office. The woman's name was Anna, and she wanted more than anything to be a nurse at the boarding house. When our hero saw the candidate for the first time, his heart suddenly began to beat faster, and his pulse quickened as if he was running fast. Running his eyes over the documents and references from his previous workplace, Thomas automatically noticed that Anna was single and was raising her son Martin alone. Thomas, as a supervisor, asked the woman a few more questions about her work and her qualifications, and then said, "Well, Anna, I think I'm ready to meet you halfway. You're a good fit for us, and we'll take you to work in our boarding house. Leave the necessary documents to my secretary and begin your duties." Anna's face lit a sweet smile, and after thanking Thomas, she left his office. After this incident, the young man's heart was literally captivated by this new employee who, despite her impressive appearance, turned out to be an intelligent and efficient employee. Thomas repeatedly noticed that Anya could work without days off and was ready to take over from her colleagues at any moment. One evening, he could not stand it and approached an employee who was late at work and said, "Anna, you've been here too long, and you clearly deserve a ride home." "Well, you can't take the electric train. Taxi drivers will charge you $3,000 for such an order." Anna smiled wryly, but did not refuse the offer. On the way home, the young people got to talking, and Thomas learned that Anna's son's father had left the family many years ago, and she had to raise him alone. "Well, I think you're very good at it," said Thomas, whose voice was distinctly respectful and sympathetic. Already outside Anna's house, he wished her a good evening and shook her hand goodbye. From then on, Thomas picked Anna up from work every day, turning it into a kind of tradition with a romantic bent. The result was a torrid romance that came as a complete surprise to both of them. Anya introduced Thomas to her son Martin, who liked the young and suave businessman at first sight. In turn, Thomas began to take his adopted daughter Maria, who had long ago become his own daughter, to visit him. Kolya and Maria became friends from day one and immediately hit it off. Being about the same age, the children were ready to play together all day long. Since Thomas had no one closer than Emily, one day he decided to introduce her to Anna. Despite the fact that the old woman could barely see, she still approved of Anya's candidacy and, without hiding it, announced it to everyone present. Thomas smiled enigmatically and, with a conspiratorial look, pulled out of his pocket a padded velvet box containing an engagement ring. Then, under the approving smiles of Maria and Martin, he proposed to Anna. Without a second's hesitation, the girl happily agreed. That evening, for the first time in years, there was merriment and joy in Emily's house. After so many years of troubles and misfortunes, the participants of this story finally found the desired happiness that they had dreamed of all these long years. About a year after that, Thomas met Betty quite by chance at a restaurant where he had come with his family to celebrate their anniversary. Taking the menu in his hands, the businessman ordered and returned the menu to the waitress. Only now, when Thomas looked up, he recognized his ex-wife and the restaurant employee. During this time, Betty had changed a great deal and had lost a great deal of weight. Her sad gray eyes no longer shone with the same ebullience of her days of wealth and independence. Of course, she recognized Thomas, though she tried not to show it. After taking her order, the waitress staggered to the kitchen on unsteady wooden legs. Once upon a time, years ago, she had made her choice and put everything on the line. Now she could only bitterly remember the past and blame herself for her own stupidity and greed that had caused her to end up at the bottom of the barrel. As is customary on such occasions, Thomas left Betty a good tip, once again emphasizing the fact that there can be nothing in common between them. Looking lovingly at Anna, Thomas is confident that a happy life awaits them, in which family and fidelity will always take first place.